Kim Betty. My blog is called Research and Revelations, and it is from the perspective of me being the great-great-granddaughter of John Fields. I've been posting since I discovered my grandfather had a slave narrative that was published. He actually has two of them, and I've been taking the time to share about that. Today, though, I'm going to really take you on a journey. I'm calling it a scavenger hunt. The word scavenger implies that you are searching and looking for something that others have discarded. Let me share with you where I got the slave narrative from, just in case you haven't been reading the blog or you're not aware of it. And the slave narrative of John Fields, it was interviewed by Cecil Miller. It is part of the Federal Writers Project from 1936 through 1938. My great-great-grandfather's narrative was recorded in 1937. He would have been at that time 89 years old. I'm going to share with you and take you on a journey of a lifetime from the perspective of my great-great-grandfather. I'm looking at it in really three different aspects of it. It is a virtual voyage that I've been on because everything that I learned about him, I learned virtually. I did make a trip to the New York Family History Center and Genealogy. So I did go and actually make a physical visit there, but they sent me home to do it virtually. I am going to take you on what I call a transformative time travel. His life from 1848 to 1953 when he passed at 104 years old. So I say transformative, and whenever I speak of transformation, I'm never trying to change someone's mind. I'm looking to change your heart. Your heart, which brings me to the third layer of this, and that is I'm taking you on, because I've been on an empathetic excursion. So I'm really asking you to put your feet in my shoes, but all of us to also put our feet in his shoes. Let me first share with you something that I did discover. It's an article by The Atlantic, theatlantic.com magazine. And it was about the Federal Writers Project, which I thought was pretty cool. And I'm just going to click around a little bit and share with you this very important information, which will give you the context of where I'm coming from today. And let's say this will set you up for your virtual voyage that you're going on with me. And it's titled Stories of Slavery from Those Who Survived It. The Federal Writers Project narratives provide an all too rare link to our past. So, and it's by Clint Smith, and I'm so glad that I did discover it. And it said this article is part of Inheritance, a project about American history and Black life. And so I'm just going to bounce around to really set the context for what I'm going to talk to you about today and why I had to go on a scavenger hunt. For many Black Americans, there is a limit to how far we can trace back our lineage. The sociologist Orlando Patterson calls it natal alienation, the idea that we have been stripped of social and cultural ties to a homeland we cannot identify. The first census to include all Black Americans by name was conducted in 1870, 5 years after slavery ended. Trying to recover our lineage can be a process of chasing history through a cloud of smoke. We search for what often cannot be found. We mourn for all we do not know. And so for me, my journey began in 2015, It was at a point in my life that I was searching. It was at a point in my life that I had just lost my mother. She had passed away, and I moved to New York for work to bounce back from the recession and the heavy hit that it had on Detroit. And I felt that I could go anywhere, and it landed me in New York. And I thought everything would be great. You know, you can't outrun your skeletons, though. And so here I am now in New York. It was as if the angels were with me, crying out in support of me as I cried out to God. I literally heard, Google your great-great-grandfather. Google your great-great-grandfather. And I Googled my great-great-grandfather and had no idea that his slave narrative existed. Mom had an old wrinkled up yellowing article that she would bring out from time to time from her credenza in the dining room. And I had a couple of pictures that I had seen him in of the 5 generations: my brother, my mother, her mother, her mother's mother, and my great-great-grandfather. And that was it. And I heard stories about him living to be 104 and that he had owned properties. Okay. So now I have in my fingertips a narrative of his perspective of being born a slave to freedom. And it was eye-opening. It was empowering. It was gut-wrenching. It solidified my resilience. It set me free in all the areas that I'm speaking of that had me feeling oppressed. I broke free. In many instances, I didn't do anything different. However, I knew that I could when I wanted to, and that was liberating. The Atlantic article goes on to say, the project did employ some Black interviewers, but the majority were white Southerners. Some were the descendants of slaveholders, in certain cases, descendants of the families that had enslaved the very people they were sent to interview, or members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization known for pushing a narrative of slavery that was sympathetic to the Confederate cause. So what they depict in this article, which a lot of people feel this way about the narratives, are there's a concern that the narratives portray formerly enslaved people as uneducated and illiterate, and that there may have been some manipulation, and that should be accounted for and taken seriously. However, the chair of the history department at the University of Texas in Austin, Miss Berry, says that there's no source in history that isn't compromised by bias in some way. And the notion that we should ignore the narratives because of their imperfection would mean applying a standard to them that is not applied across the board. For Lewis, it was a piece of history, a piece of them. It was like finding treasure. Even if the jewels aren't cut as cleanly as you'd like, they're still worth something. So again, when you look at it from the concept of a scavenger hunt of something that's been discarded, you can find treasure. And that definitely was my experience. I was able to find countless blogs and articles and recreations of his photo out there. I found lesson plans in the Library of Congress that existed that featured my great-great-grandfather's story. I was able to find the church that he belonged to that you're going to hear more about. I discovered that though the church still existed, and then the one that he co-founded out of that church also existed. So I was able to meet and talk to Pastor Lisa Hood, who is the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Lafayette, Indiana. And this particular church, as you'll hear more about, is the church that my great-great-grandfather belonged to. and married my great-great-grandmother in 1872. And he also, along with a few others, co-founded the Second Baptist Church in Lafayette, Indiana, which also is in existence today. And I was able to join the web series that Pastor Lisa had about racial inequality, and it was a group discussion, and I was able to participate in that discussion. And out of that, I was able to meet Adelia, who is on the diversity roundtable committee in Indiana as well. I got just to understand a bigger perspective based on her interest in my great-great-grandfather's story. And most miraculously, I was able to get connected to Mary Anthrope. She's a retired history teacher in Indiana and also part of the historical society there. And she took the time to copy all of the articles and pictures and stories that she had access to. I would have never gotten my hands on any of this online. Oh, and one other thing is that Pastor Lisa Hood found in the archives at the church a bunch of, or an article that he was featured in that really depicts a lot about him and his, my great-great-grandmother and her parents. But the reason why I am taking the time to do this particular blog post is because I soon learned that all of the information that I had went on a scavenger hunt to find already existed. Cecil Miller interviewed my great-great-grandfather for his slave narrative as part of the Federal Writers Project in September of 1937, and unbeknownst to me, Joseph C. Carroll, who was a black historian, interviewed him for the Indianapolis Recorder August of 1937, so just a month before. Here is Cecil Miller's interpretation of my grandfather. Let's start there. John W. Fields, 2120 North 20th Street, Lafayette, Indiana, now employed as a domestic by Judge Burnett, is a typical example of a fine-colored gentleman who, despite his lowly birth and adverse circumstances, has labored and economized until he has acquired a respected place in his community. He is the owner of 3 properties, unmortgaged, and is a member of the Colored Baptist Church of Lafayette. As will later be seen, his life has been one of constant effort to better himself spiritually and physically. He is a fine example of a man who has lived a morally and physically clean life. But as for his life, I will let Mr. Fields speak for himself. Now let's take a look at the article in the Indianapolis Recorder. The Reverend John Fields of Lafayette, Indiana. He is an example of what Negroes of yesterday accomplished by thrift and industry. He was born a slave in March 27, 1848 in Davis County, Kentucky. Although he is nearly 90 years of age, his mind is still active and he can recall incidents of the slave period with great detail and accuracy. So this is the recording of my great-great-grandfather. My name is John W. Fields, and I am 89 years old. I was born March 27, 1848 in Owensburg, Kentucky. That's 115 miles below Louisville, Kentucky. There was 11 other children beside myself and my family. When I was 6 years old, all of us children were taken from my parents. Because my master died and his estate had to be settled, we slaves were divided by this method. 3 disinterested persons were chosen to come to the plantation, and together they wrote the names of different heirs on a few slips of paper. These slips were put into a hat and passed among us slaves. Each one took a slip, and the name on the slip was the new owner. I happened to draw the name of a relative of my master who was a widow. I can't describe the heartbreak and horror of that separation. I was only 6 years old, and it was the last time I ever saw my mother for longer than one night. 12 children taken from my mother in one day, 5 sisters and 2 brothers went to Charleston, Virginia. 1 brother and 1 sister went to Lexington, Kentucky. 1 sister went to Hartford, Kentucky. 1 brother and myself stayed in Owenburg, Kentucky. My mother was later allowed to visit among us children for 1 week of each year, so she could only remain a short time at each place. My life prior to that was filled with heartache and despair. We arose from 4 o'clock in the morning, and parents and children were given hard work. After a meager supper, we generally talked until we grew sleepy. We had to go to bed. Some of us would read if we were lucky enough to know how. The greater part of the plantation owners were very harsh if we were caught trying to learn to read or write. It was the law that if a white man was caught trying to educate a Negro slave, he was liable to prosecution, entailing a fine of $50 and a jail sentence. We were never allowed to go to town, and it was not until after I ran away that I knew they sold anything but slaves, tobacco, and whiskey. Our ignorance was the greatest hold the South had on us. We knew we could run away, but what then? An offender guilty of this crime was subjected to very harsh punishment. Then he goes back to say how or share my great-great-grandfather's account of being separated from his family. My mistress had separated me from all my family but 1 brother with sweet words. But that pose was dropped after she reached her place. Shortly after I had been there, she married a northern man by the name of David Hill. At first, he was very nice to us, but he gradually acquired a mean and overbearing manner towards us. I remember one incident that I don't like to remember. One of the women slaves had been very sick, and she was unable to work just as fast as he thought she ought to. He had driven her all day with no results. That night, after completing our work, he called us all together. He made me hold a light while he whipped her, and then he made one of the slaves pour salt water on her bleeding back. My innards turned yet at that sight. Let me share now Joseph Carroll's account of the experience of separation and being enslaved. His first owner was a cruel man, Bob McFarland. John's brother, Edward Fields, killed his master when he attempted to whip him. John was then transferred to another master named David Hill. So let's just pause there for a second. Nowhere in the narrative did it talk about the fact that John's brother, my great-great uncle Edward, killed his master when he attempted to whip him. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I did in my scavenger hunt was I discovered a Google book titled History of Daviess County, Kentucky, published in 1883, and it mentioned an unsolved murder of Robert Bob McFarland, and it talked about, I'm going to read it to you. 30 years ago, this man was murdered in his bed one night for his money. He was a farmer about 10 miles south of Owensboro and south of Panther Creek. He had just been delivering his tobacco and was supposed to have considerable money about him. It was in the summer, and he was sleeping with the door of his room slightly ajar. The murderer entered the room with an axe and struck him about the eyes with the pole of that heavy implement. His wife was awakened by someone firing a weapon in the room. No clue was ever obtained to the murderers. Many ugly stories have been told concerning Mr. McFarland's family affairs, but nothing has ever been proved in court. We do not rehearse them here. So when you do the math from 1883, 30 years ago puts it at 1853, which is when my great-great-grandfather would have been about 6 years old. If he told this story to Joseph Carroll in August of 1937, do we think that he didn't tell the story to Cecil Miller in September of 1937? Or was he not comfortable telling Cecil Miller? My great-great-great grandmother and grandfather, knowing that they're getting separated and dealing with the agony of separation based on something that one of their sons did. It's a whole different context. So, Joseph Carroll goes on to say, on Mr. Hill's plantation, John saw some of the evils of slavery. So he tells a similar story as Cecil Miller. He says that once his mistress was away for several weeks, Mr. Hill forced a little girl 13 years old to have illicit relations with her master. Her mistress returned to find that girl was in a delicate state of health. She insisted the girl tell her everything, but the master had already forbade the girl to tell that he was guilty, that he was the guilty party on that pain. Then, to satisfy the wife, the master would take the girl to the woods, suspend her body to a tree, and whip her until she was almost unconscious, trying to make her tell who the father was of the unborn child. When the child was born, as a penalty of her sins, the girl was sold and taken far south, where, in the words of her master and father of her child, she would be doomed to drink the waters of Mississippi and pick cotton. And I'm back on the narrative here. At the beginning of the Civil War, I was still at this place as a slave. It looked as if the South would win, as most of the big battles were won by the South. This was because we slaves stayed at home and tended the farms and kept their families. To eliminate the solid support of the South, the Emancipation Act was passed, freeing all the slaves. Most of us slaves were so ignorant they did not realize they were free. The planters knew this, and as Kentucky never seceded from the Union, they would send slaves into Kentucky from other states in the South and hire them out to plantations. For these reasons, I did not realize that I was free until 1864. I immediately resolved to run away and join the Union Army, and so my brother and I went to Owenburg, Kentucky, and tried to join. My brother was taken, but I was refused as being too young. I tried also at Evansville and Indianapolis, but was unable to get in. I then tried to find work and was finally hired by a man at $7 a month. This was my first independent job. From then on, I went from one job to another working as a general laborer. Let's see what Carroll has to say about his going to freedom. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, but it did not affect the status of the slave in Kentucky. Hence, the masters of the Bluegrass State continued to hold their slaves until the adoption of the 13th Amendment, December 18, 1865. The Union officers, however, began to tell the slaves about the Emancipation Proclamation and to induce the Negroes to believe that the proclamation was applicable to all slaves everywhere within the limits of the United States. Although he was a mere boy, John Fields decided that he would be a slave no longer. In 1864, he would have been 16, he ran away, aided by some Union soldiers. He crossed the Ohio River, followed that stream along the northern bank under the cover of night until he finally landed in Evansville, Indiana. In the late summer of 1864, at Evansville, he offered his service to the army but was rejected because he was too young. An officer of the army assisted him in getting a ticket to Indianapolis. From Evansville to Indianapolis was his first ride on a train. When he reached the Hoosier capital, the Union officer turned him loose on Indiana Avenue and told him he was a free man, and it was up to him to look out for himself. In 1864, there were farms in the region between what is now Monument Circle and Crown Hill Cemetery. On one of these farms, young John Fields found employment at $7 a month. He proved to be such a good field hand that he was soon in demand as a wheat binder in harvest time, for which he was paid a fabulous sum of $2.50 a day. In 1869, John Fields went to Lafayette and found employment with Mr. W.S. Lingle, the editor of the Lafayette Courier, now the Lafayette Journal and Courier. Now I'm back to the slave narrative. I married at 24 years of age and had 4 children. My wife has been dead for 12 years and 8 months. Mr. Miller, always remember that the brightest man, the prettiest flower may be cut down and withered in an hour. Today, I am the only surviving member who helped organize the Second Baptist Church here in Lafayette 64 years ago. I've tried to live according to the way the Lord would wish. God bless you. Then he gives another one of his poems. The clock of life is wound but once. Today is yours, tomorrow is not. No one knows when the hands will stop. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Carol's account. In 1869, John Fields went to Lafayette, found employment with Mr. W.S. Lingle, the editor of the Lafayette Courier, now the Lafayette Journal and Courier. In 1871, he married Miss Elizabeth Scott, whose parents had built the first house on what is now North 20th Street in Lafayette. After his marriage to Miss Scott, Reverend Fields took up trade as a whitewasher, for which he received $2 a day. He would cut woods in the swamps all day and take piecework whitewashing jobs at night, get this, until he had saved enough money to build the second house in North 20th Street, in which all of his children and his only grandchild were born. When Mrs. Fields was 22 years old, he made a profession of faith in Christ, but there were no Negro Baptist churches in Lafayette, and he refused to join any other. In 1872, he and 8 other persons of color organized what is now the Second Baptist Church of Lafayette. In 1876, he became a lay preacher. He has never been ordained nor held any pastorate, but since 1876, he has been in demand as a revivalist throughout Tippecanoe County. He owns 3 houses in the most beautiful residential sections of the city of Lafayette, 2 of which are occupied by white people. His estate is valued at approximately $10,000. He had 4 children, 2 of whom still survive, 1 grandchild, 4 great-grandchildren. In spite of the fact that he is 89 years old, he is still active and in good health. And I'm going to use one more quote from the Atlantic article, and it is from someone who discovered their narratives, and they say how I felt. When I first came across the narratives, I was confused as to why I had never, not once in my entire education, been made aware of their existence. It was as if this trove of testimony, accounts that might expand, complicate, and deepen my understanding of slavery, had purposefully been kept from view. With the context of, I am completely grateful that I found the Federal Writers Project and my great-great-grandfather's slave narrative, as I'm sure the other 2,299 other descendants are as well. However, it's startling to see and juxtapose it against the article by Joseph C. Carroll in the Indianapolis Recorder from this Black historian. And I believe that it really does, for me, in the context of today, say why it is so important, number 1, for us to know our history. Number 2, for us to go on a scavenger hunt to find the truth about our history. And why it's important for us to be a stand for this history to continue to be shared, period.